My wife ran up to me at the company dinner. I pushed her away and said, "I saw you and him together. I want a divorce from you right now." The words escaped my mouth with restrained but overwhelming anger, and the moment I spoke them, the silence in the restaurant ballroom was almost deafening. Everything stopped. Waiters froze mid-service, coworkers looked away, trying to pretend they hadn't heard, but the shock on their faces betrayed the truth: everyone had heard. The soft orchestra playing in the background seemed to cease at the exact moment my voice resounded, filled with pain, disgust, a love that, in a single instant, was transformed into pure hatred. She stood there, in front of me, with her eyes wide, her breath caught in her chest, as if her soul had been ripped out by the impact of my words. His mouth opened and closed a few times, but no sound came out. I knew her well enough to know that her mind was racing, looking for an excuse, an explanation, anything that could turn the situation around, that could make me doubt what I had seen. But there was no doubt. I had seen it. I had felt the bitter taste of betrayal lingering on my tongue like poison. I knew. "It's not what you think," she managed to whisper, her voice breaking, but I laughed. A dry, cruel laugh, the kind of laugh a wounded man lets out when he realizes that everything he believed to be real was never more than an illusion. "Isn't that what I think?" I repeated, feeling my blood boil as I looked at her. "I saw you. I saw the way he held your waist, how you smiled at him like that, how your eyes sparkled." I clenched my fists, trying to control the wave of fury that threatened to overflow. "I saw everything." She reached out to me, trying to hold my arm, as if a simple touch could erase the reality that was now imposed between us. "Please listen to me, let me explain." "Explain what?" My voice sounded sharp, sharp as a blade. "Explain how you destroyed everything. How did you throw away years of our lives for a moment with him? How did you make an idiot of me?" I felt my chest rise and fall with heavy breathing, and for the first time, I noticed that my eyes were watery. I didn't want to cry. Not in front of her. Not in front of anyone. I turned to leave. I needed to get out of there. But before I could take a step, the voice of the man I now hated echoed through the room. "Calm down, man, it's nothing like that." My entire body tensed. Slowly, I turned to face him. The man was there, in front of me, wearing an expensive suit, his expression of false serenity trying to hide his obvious discomfort. He didn't seem sorry. He didn't look guilty. He looked uncomfortable. As if I were exaggerating, as if my pain was an uncomfortable detail of the night that he didn't want to deal with. My breathing became heavy. "Do you have the courage to open your mouth in front of me?" My voice was low, but carried with real threat. I wanted to punch him. I wanted to erase that arrogant look from his face. But most of all, I wanted to understand. Why? Why did she do this? Why did he think he could meddle in my life without consequences? She looked at him, then at me, and it was at that moment that I realized. It wasn't just a mistake. It wasn't an impulsive moment. The way she looked at him, how her body leaned slightly towards him, how his hand trembled next to hers but didn't move away, this wasn't just any case. This was something more. "Do you love each other?" My voice was almost a whisper. It was a question I didn't want to ask, because I feared the answer. Because the answer could be the final blow. She looked away. He frowned, not responding immediately. The silence was enough. A lump tightened my throat. I swallowed hard. I couldn't be there anymore. I couldn't look at them anymore. I walked out, pushing the restaurant doors so hard I felt the hinges creak. The cold night hit my face, but nothing was able to put out the fire inside me. I got into the car, started the engine, but my hands were shaking on the steering wheel. My eyes were fixed on the reflection in the rearview mirror, and I saw myself there, a broken man. A man who built a life, a story, only to see it destroyed in seconds. The images came back to me over and over again. Her laugh. His touch. The way they looked at each other. The blunt truth hit me with a crushing weight: I had never been enough for her. Maybe it never was. The way back home was a blur. I didn't know where I was going, I just drove, my heart beating so hard in my chest that it felt like it wanted to explode. The bitter taste of betrayal burned my throat, and no matter how much I tried to push the pain away, it came back. Relentless. Cruel. But something happened that night. Something I didn't expect. The moment I thought I had lost everything, something unexpected entered my life. And when I least expected it, fate showed me that sometimes, the end of one story is just the beginning of another. But this is a part of the story you don't know yet. Welcome to the channel. Here, we do not support cheating in any way. The stories you will hear are fictional, but they carry an undeniable truth: betrayal destroys lives, families, and trust. Each narrative is a warning about the devastating consequences of disloyalty. Now, prepare. You're about to hear a story shocking, intense, and full of twists. Fasten your seatbelts, and let's get started. The restaurant was elegantly decorated, with chandeliers hanging from the ceiling reflecting golden lights off the wine glasses and cutlery perfectly aligned on the tables. The company event brought together executives, employees, and their spouses, all dressed impeccably for the occasion. It was a night of celebration, an annual dinner where the best performances were recognized, where corporate alliances were strengthened, and where smiles and cordial greetings often hid real disputes for status and influence. Amid this sophisticated atmosphere, Ethan and Olivia seemed to be a perfect couple, an ideal image of success and complicity. He was a man with a striking presence, with an always attentive look and an air of confidence that conveyed security to those around him. She was a charming woman, with a soft smile that lit up the room and a graceful posture that made everyone admire her. Married for almost a decade, they had a life that many envied. Ethan was a respected professional, recognized for his competence and dedication, someone who rose step by step without ever losing his essence. Always attentive, always present, a man who never let his wife's subtlest details go unnoticed, like the perfume she wore, the way her eyes sparkled when she was happy, or even the way she moved her fingers absently when she was nervous. Olivia, in turn, had always been a determined woman, someone who sought balance between her professional life and her marriage. Intelligent, charismatic, and ambitious, she won over people easily, and this made her a lovely companion for any social event. To anyone looking from the outside, they were an admirable couple, one of those who seemed to have discovered the secret to keeping love alive over the years. But like every relationship, theirs also had its complexities, its moments of dense silence and implied gestures that were not always understood. Over time, the routine settled in, as happens in any long-term marriage. Candlelit dinners became more spaced out, long conversations in bed before bed gave way to the tiredness of an exhausting day, and small gestures of affection became too subtle to be noticed. Ethan noticed these changes, but never saw them as a sign of something bigger. I believe that it was just the natural flow of life, that couples mature and that love, although silent at times, still existed. He was not a man who doubted his wife. Never needed it. She was always loyal, she was always by your side. There was never a time when he wondered if something was wrong. Not until that night. The dinner passed between toasts and speeches. Olivia looked radiant, chatting animatedly with colleagues, laughing at the right moments and casting subtle glances at her husband, as if to reaffirm her presence. Ethan watched her with pride, admiring the way she captivated those around her. But something, deep down, bothered me. It wasn't a clear suspicion, it wasn't a concrete sensation. It was a diffuse discomfort, like a small piece out of place in a perfect picture. He ignored it. Maybe it was just the wear and tear of the day, the accumulation of tiredness and work. He looked down at the glass in front of him, swirling the wine slowly before taking a sip. As the night progressed, Ethan stepped away for a few minutes to talk to a colleague about a new project he was working on. When he returned to the table, Olivia wasn't there. His gaze swept the room, and he saw her on the other side of the restaurant, engaged in a conversation with someone he recognized, but whose presence there seemed out of place. Something in his expression changed. A slight tension, a discomfort that I couldn't immediately explain. He remained there, just observing, trying to capture every detail of that moment that, for some reason, awakened an uneasiness within him. Minutes later, Olivia returned to the table, smiling, as if nothing had happened. Ethan didn't mention anything. He just watched her, analyzing every gesture, every look she cast around. The discomfort was still there, growing slowly, like a shadow that lingered over him. The night took its course, and at some point, he decided he needed air. He went outside, took a deep breath, trying to get rid of that feeling. But the more I tried, the more I realized it wasn't something temporary. It was something real, something tangible, something he couldn't name but knew was there. The return home was silent. Olivia seemed carefree, checking her cell phone occasionally, exchanging messages that Ethan didn't try to spy on. He had never been a suspicious man, had never needed to question his wife's fidelity. But that night, for the first time, something in him faltered. The hours passed, and while Olivia slept peacefully next to him, Ethan remained awake, staring at the ceiling, feeling a weight he couldn't explain. And then, on a whim, he took out his cell phone, opened Olivia's call history and saw a number that was repeated more than it should have been. A number he didn't know. His heart sped up. The discomfort turned into a concrete doubt. He hesitated for a few moments before copying the number and searching for it. The name that appeared on the screen made his stomach turn. It was someone close. Close enough to make it even worse. Ethan felt a biting cold run down his spine. What was supposed to be just an ordinary night, an unimportant dinner, became a turning point. Something was happening. Something he still didn't fully understand, but knew he could no longer ignore. And from that moment on, his life would never be the same. The clock read almost 2 a.m, but Ethan was still awake. The glow of the cell phone screen illuminated her face as her eyes fixed on that number, the same number that appeared repeatedly in Olivia's call history. His chest rose and fell irregularly, as if each breath required greater effort than normal. He could simply ignore it, he could erase that number from his mind and move on, but something inside him wouldn't allow it. His intuition screamed. There was something there, something that didn't fit, something that was happening right before his eyes that, somehow, he had never noticed. Restlessness took over every fiber of his body. He got up from the bed, walking to the bedroom window, looking at the deserted street outside. He felt strange, as if he were living in a parallel reality, as if at any moment he would wake up from a nightmare that had not yet completely revealed itself. The last few weeks had been strange. Small details that, at another time, would have gone unnoticed now seemed to gain weight. Olivia spent more time on her cell phone than usual, laughing alone while looking at the screen, and a few times he caught her exchanging messages in the early hours of the morning, quickly deleting them as soon as he noticed her presence. At first, he convinced himself that he was just imagining things, that exhaustion and stress from work were distorting his perception. But that night, when he saw her talking at dinner with that man, when he noticed the way her posture changed next to him, how her laugh seemed looser, how her eyes sparkled in a way he hadn't seen in a long time, something broke inside him. A bitter feeling ran through his chest, a metallic taste in his mouth, a terrible feeling that he didn't want to accept, but that grew stronger with every second. He went back to bed and lay down next to Olivia, who was sleeping soundly. Her chest rose and fell gently, and her face seemed serene, as if she were completely oblivious to the storm brewing within it. Ethan stood there, watching her, trying to understand. How did we get here? When did things start to fall apart? He always thought that, despite the challenges, they were doing well. That the love between them was solid, that everything they had built over the years could not be shaken. But now, looking at her, he felt like a stranger in his own house. He turned to the other side, closing his eyes, but sleep didn't come. Just the doubt. Just the growing pain of uncertainty. The next day, Ethan left for work early, but his mind was far from the reports and meetings that awaited him. His head was buzzing with questions, but he still didn't have the courage to confront her. Not until you're sure. He spent the day distracted, trying not to show the restlessness that was growing inside him. But the truth is that he could no longer ignore what he felt. He decided he needed to know the truth. And that night, as Olivia said she was going out to meet some friends for dinner, he knew this was the moment. He said he had a last-minute meeting, kissed her on the forehead and watched her leave, the smell of her perfume still permeating the air. As soon as the door closed, Ethan grabbed the car keys and left immediately, keeping enough distance so that she wouldn't notice him. The journey was short. Olivia drove calmly, without showing hesitation. Ethan's heart was hammering in his chest, his hands were sweating on the steering wheel. He wanted to be wrong, wanted to find out he was just being paranoid. But every block that passed only confirmed what he feared. Olivia didn't meet friends at a restaurant. She parked in front of a discreet building, a hotel with an elegant facade, but discreet enough not to attract attention. Ethan stopped the car on the other side of the street and watched as she got out of the vehicle, looked around quickly and headed inside the hotel. His entire body tensed. What he feared was now real. There were no more doubts, no more assumptions. Betrayal was not a possibility, it was a fact. Ethan remained in the car for a few seconds, trying to process what he had just seen. His stomach dropped, and a lump formed in his throat. He felt as if he had been punched in the chest, a blow so hard it left him breathless. His mind was screaming at him to get out of there, to just ignore everything and move on. But his body didn't obey. Without thinking, he opened the car door and crossed the street, entering the hotel. The lobby was silent, the atmosphere refined, but Ethan could barely process the details around him. Every step I took seemed to drag the weight of the world with it. He approached the front desk, trying to keep his voice steady, but there was a contained fury in his tone as he asked for the name of the guest she had come to meet. The receptionist hesitated for a moment, studying him, but Ethan didn't need confirmation. The employee's look was enough. The pain turned to anger. He turned on his heel and headed down the hallway, his steps becoming firmer, heavier. Upon arriving at the indicated floor, he walked down the corridor, feeling his heart accelerate with each door number he passed. And then, in front of the door he was looking for, he stopped. The silence was deafening. His chest rose and fell erratically, adrenaline coursed through his veins. Without thinking, without hesitation, he knocked hard on the door. Time seemed to slow down. Seconds later, the handle turned, and the door opened. The scene before him was a slam dunk. Olivia was there, her hair slightly messy, her lips still damp, her clothes disheveled. And behind her, the man Ethan feared meeting. The betrayal, which before was just a suspicion, was now an open fact before his eyes. The air became heavy, the seconds seemed to drag by in absolute silence. Olivia froze, her face paling as the reality of the moment set in. The man behind her raised his hand slightly, as if to justify himself, but there was no justification that could erase what had just happened. Ethan didn't say anything for the first few moments. His gaze flickered between the two, pain written across every feature of his face. When he finally opened his mouth, his voice was low, firm, filled with deep pain. "How long?" Olivia didn't respond right away. He tried to speak, but nothing seemed appropriate. The silence that followed was the worst possible response. The truth was there, naked and raw, impossible to ignore. Something inside Ethan broke at that moment. Something irreversible. He took a step back, feeling suffocated by the air in that room. There was nothing more to be said. There was nothing more to be done. Without looking back, he turned and walked away, feeling the weight of a world collapsing on his shoulders. But what he still didn't know was that betrayal, as painful as it was just the first part of what was to come. Ethan drove aimlessly, his fingers gripping the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white. The image of the hotel room still burned in his mind. Olivia, her lips still wet, her eyes wide, her blouse disheveled, the man behind her. It all played in his head like a distorted movie, a nightmare he couldn't wake up from. Every detail, every shadow, every expression engraved like a permanent scar. The pain of betrayal pierced his chest, but along with it came a growing feeling, a restlessness, a doubt that wouldn't leave him alone. He didn't know exactly why, but he felt like there was still something more. Something that hadn't been said. Something he didn't know yet. The car stopped in front of the house. He didn't remember driving there, but there he was, looking at the door as if it were the entrance to a world that no longer belonged to him. He entered without thinking, heavy footsteps echoing through the silent hallway. The environment seemed different, as if everything there was a memory of something that no longer existed. The room, the pictures on the wall, the furniture, everything seemed distant. He sat on the couch, rested his elbows on his knees and buried his face in his hands. What came now? What should I do? The marriage had been reduced to ruins, but despite everything, a voice inside him said that this betrayal was not just an isolated mistake. There was something more. And he needed to find out. Hours passed. The clock on the wall marked a time that didn't seem to belong to him. And then the door opened. Olivia walked in hesitantly, her eyes red, her hands shaking, holding her bag. Ethan looked up, cold, distant, waiting for her to say something, anything. But she just stood there, breathing hard, as if she carried a weight greater than just her guilt. Tell me the truth, he finally broke the silence, his voice hoarse, thick with exhaustion. The whole truth. She hesitated, biting her lower lip, her gaze leaving his. The answer was there, in the way his hands shook, in the way his breathing became shorter and shorter. Then Ethan knew. It wasn't just about the betrayal. It was something bigger. Something she was afraid to say. You already know what happened. His voice was low, almost a whisper, but Ethan shook his head impatiently. I know what I saw. But I don't know what you're still hiding. Olivia closed her eyes for a moment, as if trying to gather strength. When she looked at him again, there was a deep pain there, a hesitation that made him feel the air thicken between them. I never wanted it to be like this. I never wanted it to come to this. Ethan clenched his fists, feeling his blood boil. What has it come to, Olivia? What else do I have to know? She swallowed hard, her teary eyes fixed on him. And then he said the words that made the ground disappear beneath his feet. I never planned to tell you, but I was hoping you would leave me before I found out on my own. He blinked a few times, as if he didn't understand. The air seemed to have been sucked out of the room. The silence between them became unbearable. Waiting for me to leave you, his voice came out in disbelief, filled with a shock he didn't yet know how to process. What the hell does that mean? I didn't cheat on you just on impulse, Ethan. She hugged her arms tightly to her body, as if she were trying to protect herself from the storm she knew was coming. I had already made a decision. I was already leaving. I was just waiting for the right moment. The words pierced Ethan in a different way. The pain of betrayal was already overwhelming, but knowing that she never intended to stay, that her betrayal wasn't a mistake, but rather a calculated step towards something greater, that was too much. He stood up abruptly, feeling anger and sadness mix in an uncontrollable whirlwind. You were going to leave me and didn't have the courage to tell me? Did you prefer to deceive me until I found out on my own? Did you have the audacity to look me in the eyes every day and pretend that there was still something between us while you were already planning your exit? Her lips trembled. Tears fell silently down his face, but Ethan had no more room inside for compassion. I thought it would be easier this way, she said in a faint voice. I thought if you hated me, it would be less painful. Less painful for whom? He laughed, a bitter, dry laugh, the laugh of someone who has lost everything. For me. Because, Olivia, I assure you, this was the worst hell you could have put me through. She shook her head, trying to find words that could perhaps ease the situation, but there was nothing more that could be said. Ethan ran his hands through his hair, his chest rising and falling unevenly. He never imagined that the love he felt for Olivia would end like this. Not with a betrayal, not with a cold plan for their exit, not with the total destruction of everything they had built. But at the same time, something inside him began to change. In the midst of all that devastation, in the midst of the pain and anger, a single truth rose from the wreckage. He didn't want to be there anymore. He no longer wanted to fight for someone who had already given up on him long before. For the first time that night, he felt something other than pain. He felt freedom. He felt a thread of clarity cutting through the storm. Olivia might have destroyed his heart, but she wouldn't destroy his life. And then, without another word, he grabbed his keys and walked to the door. She called out to him, but he didn't look back. He didn't need anything else. Because at that moment, Ethan realized that this wasn't the end of his story. It was just the beginning of something new. Ethan left the house without looking back, the door closing with a dull thud that reverberated within him like a definitive seal on everything that had once been his marriage. The cold night air hit his face, but it wasn't enough to put out the fire that burned inside him, a mix of anger, humiliation and something even deeper, something he couldn't name. His steps were automatic, his legs moving without him really knowing where he was going. He just knew that he needed to get out of there, he needed distance, he needed to breathe without feeling her scent permeating every corner of the house, he needed a space where he could exist without being crushed by the weight of what had just happened. The city was silent, almost deserted at that hour. Ethan drove aimlessly, the lights passing through the car window blurred, his mind numb from the whirlwind of thoughts that kept running over each other. He wanted to forget, but every detail of that conversation seemed to be engraved in his memory like permanent scars. Olivia had already decided to leave even before the betrayal. She hadn't regretted it, she hadn't hesitated, she just waited for him to figure it out on his own, she just let the pain hit him with all its force, because it was easier for her that way. He couldn't accept it. I couldn't understand how someone could love for so many years and then suddenly decide to leave without even trying to make things right. He stopped the car abruptly in front of a small bar he used to frequent years ago, a discreet, unsophisticated place where people went to forget their problems or drown them in shots of cheap whiskey. He wasn't the type to drown his pain in alcohol, but that night, anything that numbed the storm inside him a little was welcome. He walked in and sat at the counter, ordering a portion without even looking at the bartender. The drink went down burning, but he felt nothing but an overwhelming emptiness. It was only when he heard a female voice next to him that he realized he wasn't as alone as he thought. He doesn't seem like the kind of man who would come to a place like that alone. He turned his face slowly, his eyes meeting those of a woman who seemed to have read something in him that no one else saw. She had a calm but discerning look, as if she saw beyond the surface. She was beautiful, but not in an obvious way. He had the air of someone who had been through storms and survived. And you don't seem like the kind of woman who starts conversations with strangers in unfamiliar bars, he replied, his voice hoarse, tired. She smiled lightly, without looking away. I think you need someone to talk to. Ethan laughed, a dry, humorless laugh. And you are that person? She shrugged. Maybe. But first, you need to decide if you want to talk or continue drinking alone. He looked at the glass in front of him, swirled the amber liquid between his fingers, and let out a long sigh. I guess I'm trying to understand where it all fell apart. How an entire life could turn to dust in such a short time. She tilted her head, resting her chin on her hand. And have you found the answer yet? Ethan shook his head, eyes fixed somewhere beyond the counter. I thought I knew what love was. I thought I had built something that would last forever. But in the end, I was just a spectator watching everything fall apart without being able to do anything. The woman remained silent for a few moments, as if considering her words before speaking. Maybe love wasn't a lie. Maybe it just turned into something you didn't expect. Sometimes we think we know everything about someone, but in reality, we only know what they allow us to see. He stared at her for a moment, absorbing those words, feeling the weight of truth in them. Olivia had hidden so much from him, had made choices without him even having the chance to fight for them. And what happens after that? He asked, genuinely at a loss for answers. After everything you believed in falls apart. She smiled sideways, as if she had already been through something similar. You rebuild it. From scratch, if you have to. But this time, just for you. He remained silent, assimilating those words, feeling something change inside him. Maybe that was it. Maybe it was time to stop looking back. To stop trying to understand what couldn't be changed. He took the last sip of his drink, setting the empty glass on the counter before turning to her. And you? What are you doing here alone? She laughed softly, shaking her head. I guess for the same reason as you. Trying to find answers. There was a moment of silence between the two, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that happens when two people carrying wounds recognize each other's scars. Ethan didn't know what would come after that night. But for the first time in a long time, he felt like there might be an after. And that, for now, was enough. The silence inside the car was thick, filled only by the muffled sound of the engine as Ethan drove slowly, without a clear destination. The city was bathed in the gloom of night lights, but he could see nothing beyond his own thoughts, the memories that accumulated inside him like an unbearable weight. He couldn't forget the look in Olivia's eyes, the way her words had been cold, almost calculated, as if the destruction of the marriage was just an inevitable process that needed to be completed. There was no hesitation, no true regret in his voice. Just confirmation that she had already made her decision long before he realized anything was wrong. That was what hurt the most. Not the fact that she cheated, but the fact that he was never even an option to be saved. He looked away at the woman sitting in the passenger seat. She remained there, silent, watching him as if trying to decipher his thoughts. It wasn't an invasive presence, it didn't ask anything he didn't want to answer. But there was something about her, an unexpected calm that contrasted with the storm inside him. Since they left the bar, he hadn't been able to explain why he felt he needed to take her with him, why he didn't want to be alone that night. Maybe it was because, at that moment, she was the only person who wasn't connected to his pain, the only one who wasn't part of the memories that suffocated him. The road ahead stretched like an uncertain path, and for a moment, he wondered if he would ever feel whole again. He didn't want to carry that feeling forever, he didn't want Olivia's betrayal to define who he was. But how do you start again when the ground you stood on disappears? How do you learn to trust again when the person you loved most has proven capable of destroying everything without a trace of remorse? She broke the silence, her voice soft but firm. I know that look. I know what it's like to feel like everything has been taken from you all at once. Ethan tightened his grip on the steering wheel, not responding immediately. He didn't want to be analyzed, didn't want someone trying to find logic in something that felt so chaotic inside him. But at the same time, he felt like he needed to listen, that he needed to get out of his own maze of thoughts. And what happens after that? He asked, not taking his eyes off the road. She sighed, looking out the window, as if reviving something inside her too. We survive. At first, it seems impossible. It seems like each day will be a repetition of the previous day, with the same pain, the same anger, the same feeling that it will never go away. But one day, without realizing it, you wake up and realize that you didn't think about it when you opened your eyes. And then comes another day like that. And another day. Until, somehow, you find yourself again. Ethan laughed, but it was a humorless laugh, filled with disbelief. It sounds simple when you say it. But right now, all I see is darkness. And I hate feeling like she won. That she just managed to move on while I'm here trying to pick up the pieces. She looked at him for a moment before responding. Maybe because she had already moved on long before you realized. And it has nothing to do with you. It's not because you failed, it's not because you weren't enough. Some people just don't have the courage to face what they feel, and they'd rather run away. Her words resonated within him in a way he hadn't expected. Ethan had never thought of it that way. All that night, all he felt was that he had been tricked, used, cast aside like he was nothing. But maybe the problem wasn't with him. Maybe Olivia was the coward, the one incapable of facing her own heart. Maybe the betrayal wasn't just a reflection of the failure of the marriage, but rather of her failure as a human being. Someone who chose to take the easy way out rather than fight or at least have the decency to be honest before destroying him. He took a deep breath, parking the car in front of the beach. The sea stretched out before them, calm, illuminated by the pale glow of the moon. For a long moment, everything was silent again. Then he opened the door, feeling the cold air hit his face as he got out of the car. He walked a few steps on the sand, feeling the grains under his shoes, trying to absorb the immensity of that moment. Behind him, she also left, approaching slowly, respecting his space. What if I never get over this? The question escaped Ethan's lips before he could stop it. He hated the vulnerability he felt, hated the fact that despite everything, he still carried a shred of hope that it was all just a nightmare from which he would soon wake up. You will, she replied with conviction. But only when you stop trying to understand what has no explanation. You won't find logic in what she did. Because maybe there isn't. Sometimes people just destroy what they have for no reason. And it's up to you to decide if you want to keep wallowing in it or if you want to find something new. Something better. Ethan looked out to sea, letting her words wash over him. For the first time that night, he felt the anger begin to dissolve, giving way to something else. It wasn't acceptance. Not yet. But it was a start. A first step. Maybe it would no longer matter to understand what led Olivia to do what she did. Maybe what really mattered was what he did from there. And as he stood there, under the night sky, next to someone who reminded him that there was still a path ahead, he decided that he would not let betrayal be the last page of his story. The sharp wind blew against Ethan's face, bringing with it the salty smell of the sea and a strange sense of renewal. He stood there, motionless, staring at the horizon, as the waves gently broke against the sand. Behind him, that woman's silent presence was a reminder that he was not completely alone, but at the same time, that he needed to face this pain alone. It was a moment that belonged only to him. He felt the weight of the last few days crushing his shoulders, but there was something new growing inside him. It wasn't exactly relief, nor hope. But it was different from the absolute despair that had consumed him before. It was almost as if, little by little, he was learning to breathe again. He closed his eyes for a moment, trying to organize his thoughts. The betrayal was still there, throbbing, embedded in his skin like an open wound. But for the first time, he realized she didn't need to define him. I didn't need to carry that weight for the rest of my life. He felt tired of suffering, tired of trying to find answers to questions that would never have satisfactory justifications. Olivia had made her choice. And now, he would do his. You don't need to have all the answers today, her voice came low, filled with quiet empathy. Ethan turned his face to look at her. There was something comforting in his presence, a kind of understanding that required no explanation. But you need to decide what comes next. He let out a short, humorless laugh. What next? That's the question that has haunted me since the moment I saw you in that hotel. He ran his hand through his hair, letting out a heavy sigh. I spent so many years believing that my marriage was solid, that the love we built was strong enough to survive anything. But in the end, it was just an illusion. And now, everything I thought I knew about life, about myself, doesn't seem to make sense. She watched him for a moment before responding. You trusted. You believed. It doesn't make you weak. It makes you human. He took a step forward, crossing his arms against the chill of the night breeze. But now you have a choice. You can continue to live in this pain, or you can turn it into something that moves you forward. Ethan was silent, considering his words. He wanted to move on, he wanted to leave behind that story that tore him apart. But how do you do that when everything around you still seems to carry the traces of the person who destroyed you? Her home, her objects, her memories. Everything seemed contaminated by Olivia's presence. He no longer wanted to live under her shadows. Maybe I need to leave, he murmured, more to himself than to her. Get out of this town. Start somewhere else. She tilted her head, curious. And where would you go? Ethan let out a sigh and shrugged. I don't know yet. But staying here, every street, every cafe, every memory holds me back to a past that I want to forget. She nodded slowly. Sometimes change is necessary. But sometimes running away doesn't solve the problem. You can be anywhere in the world, but if you don't face what you feel, you'll still carry that pain wherever you go. He knew she was right. But still, the idea of leaving everything behind sounded like the only possible solution. And you? He asked, changing the focus of the conversation. What brought you to that bar tonight? She smiled slightly, but there was a trace of melancholy in her eyes. A similar story to yours. Someone who promised me a future and then destroyed it all without hesitation. He took a deep breath, as if removing an invisible weight. I spent a lot of time trying to understand why. Trying to make sense of something that didn't make sense. But one day, I realized that some people just don't have the capacity to love the way we expect. And so, I stopped waiting. Ethan watched her for a moment, feeling an unexpected connection to her words. And you managed to overcome it? She gave a small laugh before responding. Overcoming is not a moment. It's not a day when you wake up and suddenly everything is resolved. It's a process. Sometimes you feel good, like you're moving forward. And then, out of nowhere, something pulls you back. But over time, these relapses become shorter, less intense. Until one day, you realize that what happened no longer defines you. Ethan absorbed her words. He was still far from that stage. But for the first time, he felt that maybe it was possible. Maybe one day he too would look back and no longer feel this suffocating pain. Maybe one day, Olivia would be just a name from the past, without the power to hurt him. Thank you, he said sincerely. For listening. For being here. She smiled, a genuine smile. Sometimes we just need to be heard. And anyway, I think you needed someone to remind you that this story isn't the end. Ethan looked at the horizon again, the sea still stretching out before him, infinite and unchanging. For the first time, he didn't just see the past there. He saw possibilities. He saw a path he could follow. It wouldn't be easy. It wouldn't happen overnight. But he knew that, at that moment, he had taken the first step away from what destroyed him. And that, for now, was enough. Time passed like a slow fog, carrying with it the fragments of what was once Ethan's life. Olivia's betrayal was no longer an open wound, but a scar he had learned to carry. The sleepless nights became less frequent, the days became more bearable, and the pain that once crushed him was giving way to something different, something he still couldn't name, but which was better than the destruction he had felt at the beginning. He learned that time does not erase memories, but transforms the way they are seen. What was once an unbearable blow was now just a distant memory, a bitter but necessary learning experience. Olivia moved on with her life. The breakup wasn't as clean as she had hoped. Ethan didn't confront her, didn't yell, didn't beg. It just left her with the consequences of her choices. And it tormented her more than any revenge could. The man she risked everything for didn't stay by her side. As soon as the stability broke down, he began to withdraw, finding excuses, avoiding conversations, becoming a ghost in her life. Olivia found herself alone, without the marriage she abandoned and without the future she thought she would have. The regret came too late, when she realized that Ethan wouldn't look back, that he had truly moved on. He tried discreet rapprochements, cold messages, attempts at casual meetings, but they were all ignored. He didn't hate her, but he simply didn't see the point in carrying her presence in his life anymore. And that indifference hurt more than any grudge. Ethan started again. He left behind the city where it all happened, where every corner brought a reminder of what he lost. It wasn't an escape, but a conscious decision not to live under the shadows of a broken past. The change was not easy, but it was necessary. The first days were lonely, full of doubts, but, little by little, he built a new routine, met new people, rediscovered himself far from the identity he carried as a betrayed husband. And then, without him realizing it, the woman who shared that night on the beach with him began to become more present in his life. At first it was just a friendship, a mutual support between two hearts that bore similar scars. But over time, that turned into something more. She didn't try to fix him, nor did he try to heal her. They just found comfort in each other, a quiet connection that didn't require rushing or empty promises. For the first time, Ethan felt like he could love without fear, without carrying the weight of what he had experienced before. And when he finally realized that this feeling was real, that it wasn't just a reflection of past pain, he knew he was ready to truly move on. Olivia became just a name from the past, with no more power over him, no more space in his story. Fate took its toll on everyone. Olivia lost more than she imagined, not just Ethan, but her own chance at a fresh start with the man she risked everything for. The weight of his decisions fell on his shoulders, and loneliness became his only companion. The lover who seemed to be the outlet for her dissatisfaction just used what he needed from her and left without looking back. Without Ethan, without the other man, without the certainties she once carried, she found herself trapped in a void from which she could not escape. But that was the price of his choices. Ethan, on the other hand, learned that the end of a story doesn't mean the end of everything. Sometimes destruction is just the beginning of something new. He experienced the worst pain a man could face, but he survived, and it made him stronger. He found a new path, a new love, and most of all, he found himself. Olivia's betrayal didn't define him. What defined him was the way he chose to move forward. Now, I want to know your opinion on this story. What did you think of the ending? Leave your comment and share your vision of what happened to Ethan and Olivia. And if you are not yet subscribed to the channel, subscribe now for more impactful stories like this. Remember, this channel does not support any type of cheating. The truth always comes out, and consequences always come. Thank you for following this far. See you in the next story.